TechAfrica News podcast from Africa for Africa. In partnership with Smart Africa. Welcome to TechAfrica News podcast. I'm Akim Benamara, and today's episode is a special one. South Africa is hosting the G20 this year, and with that comes some exciting opportunities to lead global conversations around innovation, finance, and inclusion. One of those is the launch of the G20 TechSprint 2025, a global innovation challenge co-hosted by the South African Reserve Bank and the Bank for International Settlements. It's all about finding real tech solutions to some of the biggest challenges in our financial systems, with this year's focus on trust and integrity. We're talking about things like trusted digital identity, secure access to credit data for small businesses, and protecting real-time payments from fraud and cyber risks. Challenges that matter deeply here in South Africa and, of course, across the continent. Joining me to unpack all of this, Lyle Horsley, Head of Fintech Department at South African Reserve Bank. We'll talk through what TechSprint is about, how innovators can get involved, and what it means for Africa's digital transformation journey. Hello, welcome to our podcast.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me, Akim.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure. Let's start with you. Tell us a bit about your journey into the world of fintech and central banking.
Perfect. So my name's Lyle Horsley, as you mentioned. I started at the SARB a few years ago. I initially started in our legal department, so I'm a lawyer by training and background. I subsequently then moved into our Prudential Authority, which is the regulator that looks after the safety and soundness of banks. And I was in the policy team where we developed the policy frameworks. And subsequently in 2021, I then moved into the fintech unit. And our role in the fintech unit is really focused on understanding the impact of fintech on the South African financial sector and formulating responses to that innovation that's responsible and that's appropriate for the central bank to think about innovation. So it's really about understanding how do policies need to evolve in response to fintech and how do regulatory frameworks need to potentially be adapted to accommodate the appropriate kind of innovation that we want to see in the sector.
All right. So how have things evolved in the recent years in terms of the approach to digital transformation also within the South African Reserve Bank?
So I think, traditionally when people think of central banks, they think of central banks as being very conservative. And I think partly that is true. And it's important for central banks to, be conservative, execute on their mandates and so on. But I think what we are increasingly seeing is that this impact of technology within the financial sector is really changing how financial products and services are delivered to consumers.
It's accelerating fast.
And it's accelerating very quickly, right? And so I think as central banks, we are having to think about how do we respond to that kind of innovation within the financial sector, and how do central banks themselves innovate and evolve. And so I think you see this duality now with central banks themselves looking to modernize and digitally transform themselves, and then you're looking to central banks that are able to guide the industry in terms of the approach that the industry should be taking around these innovative technologies like AI, crypto assets, and developing, frameworks that are appropriate for these kinds of innovations that we are seeing. And so I think we are seeing central banks that are playing a key role in the digital transformation journeys, whether it's through things like public digital infrastructures or digital identity solutions. So I think that's something that we are increasingly seeing central banks play a lead on or actively participating in with their industries.
So you would say when we talk about a central bank and that they're mostly perceived as very conservative, they also have to find the right balance between new technology, new services, and let's say new hypes before they actually really, let's say, jump on that train.
Absolutely. So I think part of where we sit as central banks, as regulators, is that you want to make informed decisions. How do you make an informed decision? You need accurate data, you need to understand the technology, and things like a TechSprint are one way for you to get a closer understanding of how technologies can influence some of the problems that you are faced with. Of course, there are other things that you can think about, but it's really about putting central banks, regulators, in the best position to make the most informed policy and regulatory framework so that you can support innovation and, importantly, I think, mitigate the risks from the emerging technologies that we are seeing.
You just mentioned the TechSprint. Let's talk about G20 TechSprint.
Yes.
What's it all about and what makes this year so special?
So the G20 TechSprint, this is the 6th edition of the G20 TechSprint, right? So it hasn't been in place for too long, but I think it is growing in its sort of prominence, and it's something that G20 presidencies are leaning into because it's exciting. It's an opportunity for central banks, regulators to see a practical side of technology and look at how technology can support them in their policy problems and challenges that they are facing. And so we've seen from previous G20 TechSprints, they've explored global policy priorities like central bank digital currencies, cross-border payments. And so this year's G20 TechSprint, it's exciting because it's in Africa, right? It's the first time that the G20 TechSprint has come to Africa. And so we are very honored and proud to have this opportunity as South Africa to host this G20 TechSprint. Our TechSprint is focused on trust and integrity in scalable and open finance. And it's really because we see these two things as foundational pillars for the financial system. You need to have trust and you need to have integrity. If those two things are undermined, and then it undermines the entire ecosystem, right? And so we're thinking about these things in the context of increasing digitalization, whether that's through how we make our payments, whether that's through our identities. Everything's becoming increasingly digitized. And the question is, how do you build trust? How do you support integrity and build integrity when we are increasingly becoming digitized and we have these emerging innovations, technologies that are disrupting how financial services and products are being consumed. And so that's been the focal center around our G20 TechSprint.
It's also quite interesting to have this kind of challenge or the TechSprint, bearing in mind that Africa is a mobile money continent.
Yes.
I mean, we have so many mobile money operators throughout. I mean, it's I would even say it's quite unique compared to other areas.
Absolutely. And we think even in the context of Africa and the challenges that we are facing, despite the extensive mobile money uptake and use in Africa, we still think that the problem statements would resonate because it's about how do you KYC your mobile wallet?
Yeah.
What identity do people use to open that mobile wallet? How do you think about sharing data? So once you have people's data, whether it's through a fast payment system, whether it's through a mobile wallet solution, how are you able to share data in a more open finance sort of framework where people can access other kinds of financial services and products? And then importantly, even whether it's mobile money, fast payments, how do you mitigate the fraud and how do you mitigate the cyber risks? Yeah. And so, when we crafted these problem statements, we were quite mindful of what has come before us. We wanted to build on previous G20 presidencies, but we also wanted problem statements that were relevant for Africa, for South Africa, so that we look to solve real world challenges, right? The things that are actually happening on the ground that regulators are having to think about. And so we hope that through this G20 TechSprint, solutions would come to the fore that are not only relevant for South Africa and the digital transformation work that we are doing, but that they also do serve other regulators and help regulators see maybe, new solutions or new ways that some of the challenges that they are facing can be solved.
Kind of a blueprint.
Absolutely, yeah. And so we hope that it stimulates other regulators as well. It is a global call to action, and we really are looking forward to seeing what comes out of this.
Yeah, me too. I'm very excited. So the TechSprint is all around 3 problem statements.
Yes.
Let's start with the first challenge: verifiable, privacy-preserving digital identity. So why is digital identity still such a major barrier in Africa and in financial systems?
So I think there's a lot that's happening around digital identity, and often the solutions are sort of siloed, right? So everyone's coming up with a way to solve for this problem. But I think at the same time, a digital identity is going to be foundational in how we think about our digital transactions. So in the same way currently that today, if I want to do anything, it often starts with who are you, right? And I would have an ID, a passport, some kind of mechanism to show that I am who I say I am. And so this problem statement is really saying, so if we take that, extrapolate that to a digital environment, how do we think about how do you verify yourself in the digital world, right? So how do you make this verified ID that you currently have, whether it's issued by your government or, a department, and how do you make that available in the ecosystem so that you reduce costs of compliance, so that you reduce fraud, so that you potentially make it easier for people to access the financial system? Because oftentimes it will be, well, I don't have this physical document with me, right? But if you could move with a digital version of that, which is quite secure, which is verifiable, which protects your privacy, and you can then share that with the financial institutions that you want to engage with, we think that's quite a powerful thing. And how do you think about that in a scalable way? So not only solving, one institution solving their sort of digital ID for their customer, but really thinking about this at an ecosystem level where digital identity can be, potentially used by a few institutions. And I don't need to sort of have this repeated exercise that currently happens where, you have to repeat KYC depending on who you're engaging with, but to think about this in a more scalable sort of way. And so that's what this problem statement is really looking to solve.
You mentioned a valid point. I mean, KYC is still a big problem in Africa. Yes. So just out of curiosity, what do you think could be the role of the MNOs, especially in that field, where they have so many clients throughout the continent?
So I think that they can be a big contributor to how we think about identity, right? Because even with an MNO, you need to still provide your identity solution, your identity when you open that kind of transaction. And so, especially if you have mobile money and you have MNOs that are providing that kind of service, they would potentially be housing people's digital identities as well. And so I think they become a key player in the ecosystem. And so we need to think about, well, if you have banks that hold your data and you have mobile network operators holding your data. And that's where the data sharing piece and the open finance comes in. Because open finance is really about how do you enable data sharing in a secure, consented way, right? And so that data could be moving from a bank to an MNO. It could potentially be moving from an MNO to another financial institution. One of the things that comes up, for instance, is if you think about SMEs and using their sort of cell phone transactions or the payments that you make on your mobile contract every month, and using that as a way to show your cash flow or your sort of transactions that you are doing. That could be a data sharing that happens, from a mobile operator to, a party that wants to offer a loan to an SME. So that's just one way that we can think about data sharing and the role of MNOs in sort of an open finance framework.
But do you see that more as a challenge for the continent or on a national level? Because I mean, if I imagine if you would like to empower cross-border, let's say business, trade, etc., shouldn't we find a way, kind of a Pan-African KYC standard?
I think that's a very good point. And so that's the work that is currently being spoken about, like the sort of eKYC process. And then how do you share data across borders? I think that absolutely is sort of the next thing that we do have to think about. So from a South African perspective, I think we're trying to solve for it domestically in terms of how we think about digital ID and having this verified ID that can support you or be used for purposes of your onboarding and ongoing verification and authentication. But absolutely, if you then think about cross-border transactions and being able to expand businesses across border or access financial services across border, then you start thinking about data portability across borders, not only locally. And then absolutely it does become very relevant to think how do we then share data. And I actually think with many things, the problem is not the technology, right? It's around kind of legal considerations.
Political will. Political will.
And that as well. So I think that the TechSprint is really just an opportunity for us to surface what's out there, what solutions could we potentially be thinking about, and then to think about, the next steps in terms of supporting those innovations.
That makes sense. So what are the key tensions between verification, privacy, and inclusion that this challenge is trying to address?
So I think as we stand at the moment, there's the low digital adoption is around not having the right paperwork or identity to identify who you are, the right mechanism to identify who you are. And if you are then not participating in the ecosystem, that impacts financial inclusion, right? So if the processes where we look at how do you do a know your customer and all of that, if it's cumbersome, if it's not enabling enough, which is where we currently are, right? It's very paper-based. It's very prone to fraud in terms of identity theft and these kinds of things. And so a digital identity is really saying, how can we have something where, from the ease of your phone potentially, or you have something that's digitally available to consumers, where there's a low barrier to sort of adopting that kind of innovation, but that empowers consumers to be able to, easier onboard themselves or be able to transact in the financial ecosystem. And so we know that the KYC piece is often seen as a barrier, right? And so it's really trying to see, how do you lower that barrier? How can you digitally enable consumers, but do it in a way that is privacy preserving, do it in a way that protects the consumer in terms of their privacy, and do it in a way that fosters trust in the system and doesn't take away trust in the system. And so that's really what this problem statement is looking to do. And we think if you have that, then you would bring more people into the financial system. So currently we know from a South African perspective, for instance, many people have bank accounts. I think it's something like 84% or maybe even higher have bank accounts. So what you want to be able to do is allow people to transact with those bank accounts and have access to other kinds of financial services. So from my deposit in my bank account, I now also, want an investment product, and I also want to take out insurance. And all of those would require you to confirm who you are and verify who you are. And so we hope if you have a digital identity, which is something that you can easily make available, it will then enable you to broadly participate or participate more widely within financial services and products.
All right, thank you. The second challenge looks at enabling SMEs to securely share their credit data across platforms and borders. So why is the credit data portability such a big thing and hurdle at the moment, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses?
So this problem statement is really about two things. The one is the access to finance for SMEs, and we know that this is a challenge for SMEs in terms of there aren't many opportunities or services available to SMEs to access finance, right? What's currently there is a bit restrictive to them. And so it's really thinking about how can we unlock some new ways for SMEs to access finance. And then the second part is to think about this in a context of open finance, right? And so this is the idea of data that an SME would be able to share with a third party, data that the SME has consented to share with a third party, to potentially see whether SMEs are able to access different kinds of financial products that are potentially cheaper to them, financial products that give them better rates, financial products that better serve those SMEs. And so it's really around this challenge of how do we think about open finance and what kind of data we can share, but also then enabling SMEs to access finance from different institutions and potentially giving them better sort of a better servicing as SMEs.
How would you describe the current structural or technical blockers that prevent SMEs from leveraging of their financial history, for example?
So I think some of the current blockers is around how data is shared or not shared within the ecosystem. And so currently, for instance, there's also an element of informality, I think, with SMEs, which is a challenge, right? And so that's why, to me, the problem statements do relate to one another then, because if you have SMEs that use digital payments, you then create a digital footprint as an SME. If you have a digital footprint, you can show your cash flow. And that's the most important thing, for instance, with lending to an SME. You want to see cash flow and you want to sort of see the solvency of this entity to be able to repay you on what you want to be repaid. So I think there is a high level of informality, which is one issue. And then I think in terms of the data sharing and how that sharing currently happens, it is limited. And so many jurisdictions have started looking at open banking and open finance frameworks, right? Which is to say, how do you enable data sharing from an institution who's holding your data with an institution that can potentially offer you a different product or service? And so if I'm an SME and I'm currently banking with X financial institution or a specific bank, you want to be able to share your bank statements, for instance, with a third party, so that third party can see sort of, what your transactions have looked like and make an assessment in terms of your affordability and the kind of credit and the terms of that credit that they can make available to you. And then there could be other kind of data that you may want to share as an SME. And so this problem statement really talks to that and empowering SMEs to look at different avenues to serve their financing needs.
All right. So fraud and cyber risk mitigation for fast payments, also one of the problem statements. So why are these systems becoming more vulnerable?
So I think, so we're seeing increasing adoption of fast payment systems in Africa.
Yeah.
It's sort of the next innovation in payments, I think. The idea that a payment can move from me to you in under kind of 10 seconds, right? So previously it used to take a day and then it became maybe a few hours, but now we're looking at seconds. And that's obviously just, like I said, the evolution of payments innovation. I think the counter of that is that the fraud also happens near real time now. And so your chances to intervene as
you have to keep up.
To have oversight of these systems becomes really important, right?
Yeah.
Because now things are moving in real time as well. And I'm by no means a fraud or a cyber expert, but the risk here is that if the money moves immediately, the fraud also almost happens immediately, right? Or near real time. And so I think with this problem statement, we are saying that we know that many jurisdictions, including in Africa, are looking at either they have adopted fast payment systems or they are implementing in the process of adopting fast payment systems. In South Africa, for instance, we've recently launched PayShap as our fast payment system. And so to not undermine trust in this payment rail, we need to think about how do you mitigate fraud and how does fraud look different in a fast payment versus, in a more traditional payment. And how do we think about cyber risks when we're talking about a fast payment system? And so we think that this problem statement, again, is relevant to not only South Africa and the work that we are doing around fast payment systems, but more broadly. And again, to say that if there is extensive fraud on the rail, there will not be trust in that rail and you won't drive digital adoption, right? So if you're trying to have whether it's SMEs, whether it's individuals, move to, a digital form of payment, and you want it to be in your fast payment system where it's convenient, it's super quick, it's super easy, you have to mitigate the fraud and the cyber risk to maintain trust in that payment system.
So, but what are the specific risks central banks and regulators are concerned about when it comes to speed versus security?
Gosh, I think it's a tough balance that you have to walk, because the appeal of the fast payment is that it moves so quickly. That's the convenience. You don't have to wait, days to be paid. And so people suddenly can manage cash flow much better because they are receiving things really quickly, their money really quickly, right? But on the
almost
other
like
hand,
a cash transaction.
It's almost like it's trying to mirror like a cash transaction, especially if you have them at near zero cost, which some jurisdictions have done. They've made them free or some transactions free. Then it starts looking and feeling a lot like cash, right? And on the other side of that is that it does need to be secure in terms of how the money moves and that there's not fraud that takes place that undermines this payment system. And so I think it's also important to think about the type of fraud that happens on the rail, right? And so there's system kind of fraud, and then there's the social fraud where it's, social engineering kind of stuff. And so that's why with fast payment systems, there's a complement around digital literacy, financial literacy, so that you empower consumers to understand the risks and to be able to make better sort of decisions around clicking on links and these kinds of things. But I do think that the speed is an important component of the fast payment system. But as I said, if the payment rail is not secure and if people don't trust using that payment rail, then it will undermine not only the rail, but also just digital adoption of that payment trail.
True. That's a very valid point. So we just covered the 3 problem statements. So if you see it from a call to action perspective, so for innovators and developers listening, so why should they get involved?
So I think there are a few things about the problem, about the TechSprint that's quite unique. The one is that it's global, right? So I think for innovators and for fintechs, developers, it's an opportunity to contribute to a policy challenge which policymakers globally have articulated as a challenge. So there's this opportunity to collaborate and to contribute towards problem solving. Now, it's not going to, one solution isn't going to solve all the problems, but I think it's just a contribution to how we think about these problems that we've identified. I think it's also in running a tech sprint, it's time bound. You do a tech sprint over your G20 presidency, and there's timelines within which solutions need to be submitted and technologies need to be developed and so forth. And so it almost accelerates the process. Things that would have maybe taken a little bit longer under a tech sprint, they sort of get accelerated, right? So the development is accelerated, the problem solving is accelerated, the collaboration is accelerated. And so I think it's a massive opportunity to be able to work with central banking community, with your regulator, to be on a global stage and to do this in a really short space of time, which maybe puts teams under pressure, but I think it's also good to have it, be time bound so that we can think about the innovation in a very rapid way. And so, and of course there's the prize money, right? So there's 10,000 stipend for the shortlisted proposals and a 30,000, this is dollars, US dollars, a $30,000 prize, US dollar prize for the winner in each problem statement. And so, but I think for me, it's really about the opportunity of contributing to a public good. That is the real kind of appeal around the G20 TechSprint.
And can be an eye-opener for the regulator and central banks within a short time frame.
Absolutely.
Having probably 40 solutions for 3 major problems, that's quite a big pool of solutions you can go
and
fishing.
I think, again, just globally, right? So it's not only calling on South African fintechs, not only calling on African fintechs. We are looking at global innovators. And I think really an opportunity for us as central banks, as the regulators, to see things that, we maybe haven't thought about, to think about problem solving in a way that we may not have been thinking about, and to really, I think, be open to how technology can aid us in how we think about the public good, right? And I think that's a really important thing as well.
In your view, what would be a successful outcome of the tech sprint?
So I think that the way I would measure the success is if we have good quality proposals or submissions that come in. Of course, I would love to see innovators from South Africa and Africa put in their proposals. But I think good quality proposals that are coming in and really looking to solve the problems in a sort of tangible and practical way, There was a comment that was made at the launch event that really resonated with me, to say that in Africa, we solve real world problems, right? So I think if we can have solutions that really take us a step forward in how we think about these policy priorities, because I think these are challenges that we are facing as regulators and as central banks. And I think if we can have solutions that take us a step forward in our thinking, whether it's in terms of how we as central banks, what role we play in digital identity or in, fast payment systems, I think for me that would be a win. And importantly, just the collaboration, right? Oftentimes central banks and fintechs maybe are not natural collaborators, but I think the tech sprint is an opportunity to bring together these two different kind of groups, your central bankers, your regulators, and your innovators, and to sit together and see the perspectives from each other's, see each other's perspectives. I think that would also be, a good outcome of the G20 Tech Sprint.
So we see a lot, especially in the tech sphere, the tech technology is always faster than policies or regulation, which is also
Yes.
a big struggle we have in many areas. So how do you see a tech sprint influencing long-term policymaking? For example, if you look at SARB or across the continent or regulators, and can these initiatives help to close this gap we have? Because at the end of the day, we talk about fast-moving innovation and probably a slower-moving regulation.
Yes. So I think this is a challenge that we have as regulators. I think the TechSprint is a tool.
Yeah.
It's a tool that we didn't always have in our toolkit, right?
Yeah.
So if you think 15 years ago, no one was talking about tech sprints. No one was talking about sandboxes and so
Then the
forth.
internet came, then
Yeah.
the online banking.
Yes.
And we still have the same regulation.
So I think that, if we see tech sprints as one tool that
Yeah.
we've now gained as central banks or as financial sector regulators, and it's a tool to help us be very clear in terms of what we're trying to solve for. So having a clear articulation of the problem. And then working with your innovative community to help you solve for that problem. I think what it does is it gives you an insight that you didn't have before. Before, if you wanted to solve a problem as a regulator, perhaps you went and you did some research and you wrote a policy paper and you consulted on the policy paper.
Yeah.
And I think that's still very valid. But I think now you have an additional tool. You can put out a problem statement. You can collaborate with the industry around innovative solutions. You can stimulate, young, innovative thinkers to help you solve the problems. And I think it can become an important contributor to how we think about getting closer to the technology, understanding the limitations, the opportunities around the technology, and ultimately making better, more informed policy and regulations as well.
So we see a lot, especially in the public sector, that we need to have a change. We need to see the change of mindset.
Yes.
Do you think that such initiatives can really help and accelerate this change of mindset?
I think absolutely. So I think what's exciting with the G20 TechSprint is doing it on such a big scale. But I hope that from here, you can see an offshoot of that with a regulator that puts out a problem statement as a tech sprint that they run, right? And so it doesn't have to be big and it doesn't have to involve the whole world. It can start becoming very kind of focused and specific. And so I think that hopefully from this experience, we would all have gained as regulators and as policymakers, and we would all be emboldened to think creatively about how we get closer to innovation, how we stimulate the ecosystem, so that we drive the right kind of innovation that we want to see, right? And so, like I said, a tech sprint isn't, it's one thing that now we've got. And I think if regulators and central banks get more comfortable in structuring these tech sprints, I think absolutely it can be used as something to get closer to technology going forward.
Great. I mean, could be amazing national platform for innovation. Yeah?
Absolutely.
For African innovators building solutions in this space, what role does cross-border collaboration play? We talked about that earlier briefly. And do you see room for regional innovation ecosystems to emerge from initiatives like this?
So I think that the cross-border piece is becoming increasingly important because, the world is becoming integrated and things are becoming more and more related. So I think there are currently discussions that are taking place to say, how do we think about regional coordination and collaboration, whether that's through like a tech sprint. And I think nothing stops us from thinking about an African tech sprint, right? I think there have been other tech sprints that have taken place already. So I think that I hope that this has a galvanizing effect, right? That it's a catalyst to how we think about innovation on the continent, innovation in South Africa. And so I think that we are at the start of how we think about collaboration in this innovation tech space. And so I definitely hope that, going forward, there would be opportunities for us to think about this regional collaboration and how we put out problem statements that we can potentially put to the innovators on the continent to help us. And I think that can be something that hopefully gets stimulated through this tech sprint.
Digital transformation still remains one of our biggest challenges on the continent in different verticals. From your side, from the regulator perspective, from a central bank perspective, what do you think are our biggest challenges as of today? Which are ones the most important ones we have to fix quickly in order to not get overrun by AI, by other solutions, or probably by let's say multinational service providers? So more to empower the Africans as well.
Yeah, so I think that I think there are still some sort of infrastructural constraints that we face. So in terms of, access to the internet, the costs of data, those are things that are still a challenge around digital transformation. I think that what we see from central banks increasingly is this active role that they are playing in developing or collaborating to have infrastructures in place that can support digital transformation.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about things like payment systems, things like identity infrastructures, things like settlement systems where transactions settle. So I think there is a role for central banks to play in supporting this digital transformation and almost having them as an infrastructure layer that they develop or support, and having innovators come in and innovate on top of the platforms and the infrastructures that central banks provide. And then I do think that there's a role to play in how we think about the regulatory frameworks, right? So earlier you mentioned some of the regulations haven't changed. I think there is a role to play in terms of developing frameworks that are able to respond to the innovation that we are seeing. So if we see that some of our frameworks are not appropriate or that they don't, deal with the kind of innovation that we are seeing in a way that both allows for the benefits of the innovation to come through, but also for the risks to be mitigated. Again, I see that as a role for central banks to play in creating that framework to support the innovation and for innovators to understand, how their innovations will be treated and whether it's innovation that is regulated, not regulated, and what the position is around policymakers. So I think those three things become three important parts, the structural kinds of issues around that drive digital transformation, having infrastructures on which innovators can build and develop, and then having clear frameworks to enable the innovation.
So at the end of the day, it has to be a public and private sector partnership and ongoing conversation.
Absolutely, yes. I think that's critical. Central banks or the public sector alone doesn't deliver this, and the private sector alone doesn't deliver this. Exactly. I think you do need the two to come together. And that's where we talk about this idea of digital public infrastructures. It's really about the public good and using technology for the public good. And I think that's absolutely crucial, and it requires the collaboration.
True. If you look ahead for the next 5 years, where do you see the industry from your perspective? Where do you see the regulation in 5 years, also from a financial inclusion perspective?
Gosh, in 5 years, these are always very tough questions around looking in the crystal ball and what do you see? I do think that just based on some of the interventions and priorities that central banks are busy with at the moment, and you can already see in some jurisdictions where they've moved, like Brazil, like India, we've seen that financial inclusion has shifted. We've seen this digital adoption. They've brought people into the ecosystem. And so I think other central banks are looking and seeing, what role can they play? And so I think we will see central banks that do look to play a role in this digital public infrastructure layer to support financial inclusion outcomes. I also think that, with things like AI, that will have a big impact on how financial services are consumed, how financial services are distributed to consumers. And so I think with that, again, while it presents tremendous opportunities, I think we must also be mindful of some of the risks and being very active in how we mitigate some of those risks. and empowering consumers, right, to understand the risks and to make better sort of financial decisions and safeguarding themselves within the digital economy. And so I think we'll see increasing digital adoption, but we'll also see increasing risks. And we need to find a way of how we balance those so that, again, we have trust and integrity in the system.
So you're optimistic?
I am optimistic. I am, I'm an eternal optimist. We have to be. I think that, but it's again through collaboration, right? We have to collaborate with one another. We have to have lines of communication, dialogue around these things. I don't think it's only for one part to solve. I think there's definitely a role for governments, for central banks, financial sector regulators to play, and absolutely a role for innovators, financial institutions to play as well.
What role does AI play in that whole financial inclusion, central banking, financial, let's say, field?
So, I mean, I think a lot of the AI, what we are seeing, it's still emerging in the South African context at least, but we do see that, it's increasingly being used to look at things like fraud, fraud detection, right? So I think there's a good use case if you can pick up anomalies in payments and it can assist you in how you think about mitigating fraud. There are things like chatbots that get developed in terms of, if consumers have queries, if they are able to have mechanisms where those queries can be resolved fairly quickly and simply. If there are things like risk management, again, that you can use AI. So I think that what we're seeing is in different business areas, there's exploration around how AI can bring those efficiencies, potentially enable people to be onboarded much quicker. If you can have, risk assessments or just assessments in terms of what kind of products, your insurance premium, how that gets done. If all those things can become more tailored to you as a consumer, if it can potentially be more efficient and lower the barriers to adoption, I think those are all good things. But I think that we also need to be, we need to play a bit of devil's advocate with some of the stuff, right?
Yeah.
So we mustn't just assume that all things AI is better and quicker and faster and cheaper. I think you have to really...
It needs a conservative assessment.
It does need to, you do need to look at it a bit conservatively, and also, especially if you want to achieve financial inclusion, it's really about, bringing people into the ecosystem, but giving them products that are appropriate for them, that don't sort of, that are not more risky and, get them to worse outcomes. So I think that AI will have an increasing role to play, and I think the role of regulators is to sort of look at those, how it's being used and adopted, to make sure that, public outcomes are still achieved in terms of fair customer outcomes, treating customers fairly, and, those kinds of things, remain important.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thanks for being with us, sharing these valuable insights in the TechSprint 2025 and in your work, the work you're doing with SARB. I mean, it's a big moment for South Africa as G20 host, and even bigger opportunity for innovators across the continent to step up, bring real solutions, and help shape the future of finance, not just here, but of course globally. So if you're a developer, fintech, or creative problem solver, now it's the time to get involved. We share more in the show notes. You can find this session everywhere: YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay tuned for more stories at the intersection of tech, transformation, and Africa's digital future.